The rise of reefer madness. Aside from infrequent accounts of hash smoking by East Indian and Lebanese immigrants, there is little, if any, evidence that the recreational use of marijuana had any cultural foothold in America prior to the influx of Mexican laborers in the early 1900s. However, the Mexicans' custom of smoking the flowering tops of the female plant almost immediately drew concern from public officials and law enforcement, who alleged that inhaling the drug empowered users with superhuman strength and turned them into bloodthirsty murderers. As early as 1913, a handful of cities and states in the American South began prohibiting the use of marijuana, and by the early 1920s, numerous western states, including California, Colorado, Nevada, Texas, Utah, and Wyoming, had outlawed possessing pot. In many of these states, the public rationale for this crackdown was as racially motivated as it was transparent. All Mexicans are crazy, and this stuff, referring to marijuana, is what makes them crazy. Other regions of the country followed suit, including many states that had virtually no Mexican immigrant population and virtually no reported incidents of marijuana use to speak of, arguing that legislation was necessary to preemptively stop the spread of the devil's weed before it reached their borders. By the late 1920s, lurid newspaper headlines and editorials promoting the alleged dangers of marijuana began sweeping the nation. This excerpt, taken from a July 6, 1927 New York Times story, epitomizes the content and tone of much of the reporting of this era. Mexican family goes insane. 5 said to have been stricken by eating marijuana. A widow and her 4 children have been driven insane by eating the marijuana plant, according to doctors who say there is no hope of saving the children's lives and that the mother will be insane for the rest of her life. 2 hours after the mother and children had eaten the plants, they were stricken. Neighbors, hearing outbursts of crazed laughter, rushed to the house to find the entire family insane. Examination revealed that the narcotic marijuana was growing among the garden vegetables. The public's concern over the supposed marijuana menace grew, and in 1930, Congress responded by establishing the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, FBN. Selected to head this new agency was a law and order evangelist named Harry J. Anslinger. For the next 3 decades, Anslinger would single-handedly dictate U.S. drug policy. Many of his highly sensationalized views on weed linger in the public mind to this day. Beginning in the mid-1930s, Anslinger and the FBN launched an unprecedented for the time media campaign warning Americans of the alleged perils of pot. By this time, the drug's use was not only popular among Mexican immigrants, but it had also become vogue among certain segments of the African American community, most notably Southern jazz musicians. The Bureau warned that smoking marijuana inspired blacks and Hispanics to commit rape and engage in other acts of uninhibited violence. His sex desires are aroused, and some of the most horrible crimes result, one widely disseminated FBN news bulletin reported. He hears light and sees sound. To get away from it, he suddenly becomes violent and may kill. Seizing upon many white Americans' pre-existing racial prejudices, Anslinger often emphasized that these alleged acts of violence were primarily directed toward Caucasian women. Anslinger further claimed that Mexican dope peddlers frequently offered free samples of marijuana cigarettes to children on their way home from school. Parents, beware, your children are being introduced to a new danger in the form of a drugged cigarette, marijuana. Anslinger warned in a prominent FBN radio address, young people are slaves to the narcotic, continuing addiction until they deteriorate mentally, become insane, and turn to violent crime and murder. Possessing a flair for the theatrical, Anslinger bragged about keeping a gore file consisting of outrageous, unsubstantiated, and sometimes fraudulent newspaper stories that detailed pot's supposedly mind-altering and behavioral effects. One such account read, while under the influence of the drug, the subject thrust his hand through his hair and found that his fingers passed through his crackling skull and into his warm, cheesy brain. Predictably, Anslinger's and the FBN's anti-pot diatribes fueled national headlines and prompted legislative action. By 1935, most states in the country had enacted laws criminalizing the possession and use of pot, and newspaper editors were frequently opining in favor of stiffer and stiffer penalties for marijuana users. As Anslinger's rhetoric became prominent, he found additional allies who were willing to carry his crusading message to the general public. Among these were the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Hearst newspaper chain, the latter of which luridly editorialized against the insidious and insanity-producing marijuana in papers across the country. Members of state and local law enforcement also joined the FBN's anti-marijuana crusade. Writing in the Journal of Criminology, Wichita, Kansas police officer L.E. Bowery asserted that the cannabis user is capable of great feats of strength and endurance, during which no fatigue is felt. Bowery's overwrought screed, which 4 years thereafter would be hailed by advocates of prohibition as the definitive study of the drug, concluded sexual desires are stimulated and may lead to unnatural acts such as indecent exposure and rape. Marijuana use ends in the destruction of brain tissues and nerve centers and does irreparable damage. If continued, the inevitable result is insanity, which those familiar with it describe as absolutely incurable and without exception ending in death.